Hi, welcome to the second trailer for the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and I'm the host. In this trailer, you'll hear some short excerpts from some of the first 29 episodes. Many of our episodes are interviews with smaller, independent winemakers, people who I think are making great wine from carefully farmed fruit. I've also spoken with some of the farmers growing those grapes, authors, sommeliers, merchants, and California wine history round out the current crop of episodes. These are all folks worth supporting either directly or through your local wine shop. Hope you enjoy the clips and stay to check out some of the full-length episodes. You can reference the show notes to see the excerpts in order of appearance. Questions, comments, or suggestions can be sent to indiewinepodcast@gmail.com. Here we go.
I was like a little detective, running on leads. I was calling up farmers in Simi Valley. I heard you had a bush of that in the back. Is it still there? And, it was all crazy stuff like that. And then I could never ever get any amounts, It was always like, oh, maybe there's one left, So I was very glad. And finally, this one actually came up on winebusiness.com, and I couldn't believe it. And it's like Mission grapes, 80 tons available. I'm like, what the hell? And I remember I was so nervous, like he was going to sell it to someone else. I didn't know that nobody, at that time, 2018, nobody really were that into them. That's kind of come a little bit later now. But anyways, I was like, you have to promise me you reserve at least 4 tons for me. He's like, don't worry, it's not going to sell out.
When we bought the place, I was really interested in biodynamics and sort of attracted by a lot of the ideas in it and also kind of not so attracted to other ideas in it. So I thought, well, this is like virgin land. This would be a really good test. Nothing's ever been farmed here before. I think it was back in the 40s and 50s. They used to graze cattle here. So that's it. And I thought this would be a really good, kind of test case, So we were actually certified biodynamic for 4 years or 5 years or something like that. And then in the meantime, I had gotten into the Fukuoka thing, which is even kind of more radical. And I had become also a little bit kind of disillusioned with biodynamics, and it's another calendar, and there's things, and I was trying to get away from that a little bit. I only want to do things that are necessary and when they're necessary.
On the flip side, I think there's also another demographic that is a little bit more adventurous and wants to try new things. But I was a little bit frustrated that people weren't buying the wines to kind of try to understand their region, and we're just buying it to try a new varietal. I mean, to me, that's why you pay big bucks for real wine. That's why we obsess over wine is, if the wine doesn't do like the intellectual work of defining the territory that you're working in, I'm not sure it's worth paying this $75 or whatever it is. And I see a lot of bottlings in those kind of rarefied price ranges. It's great. People are putting a lot of work and effort into it, but I'm not sure it does the sort of intellectual job that I prefer if I'm going to shell out that amount of money. I didn't have any examples of the sorts of wines I wanted that I thought explain my region well, explain the history well of the region. It's very hard to find old bottles of Paso wine.
Barbera, again, is another fun grape varietal, has a lot of history in Piemonte. They don't export it as much because that's what they drink there. So they kind of keep it to themselves and, has great acid, has great structure, but it also is like plush and a lot of fruit. So it's just an enjoyable wine. I also wanted to make a red wine that my mom would understand, and her, I like to drink natural wines, but my approach is delicious first. And, you want to honor the grape varietal. So I do like fun natural wines that taste funky and, there's all these different things. But for me, I guess I'm more into classic styles. So playful ways of making or a playful play on a classic, basically. So with the Barbera, the partially carbonic, I just wanted it to be a little playful, a little joyful, chillable red that, it's still a Barbera. You still have that structure. It's still classic when you think about it, but just there's a little twist to it.
Shifting that growing season later, it allows you to hit veraison on a lot of varieties when the sun angle is lower in the sky. The days are getting shorter. And so what we find, especially on varieties like Grenache or Gamay Noir, sensitive varieties, that Brix buildup is significantly slower than other areas. So when we push the elevation higher, we can really sit back and watch that Brix build much slower, a tenth, 2/10 per day. And the harvest decisions can be based much more around textures and flavors and not so much about the bottom dropping out of the acid and the sugar spiking through the ceiling. So you're really able to dial in the style of any given wine.
I knew I was ready to be a winemaker in title, and I was 35 at the time. Yeah, I was 35, and my mentor, Michael Michaud, was leaving, and they brought in another guy who was going to be my boss. But I thought I was ready to step up and be the winemaker, and so I guess that didn't sit too well with me, so I left probably too soon. I probably could have learned a lot from this winemaker they brought in. Really good guy, Dan Carlson. But I quit all of a sudden and went off and thought I was going to go to France. Thought I was going to go do a stage in France. But I got offered a job in Los Gatos at Testarossa Vineyards as the winemaker. And so that was enough to keep me in the States.
Winemaking in Alta California at the time was rudimentary, but recognizable if you squint. Grapes were first harvested into woven baskets by the Native American neophytes. Sharp knives were rare, and the clusters were mostly pulled off the vine by hand and dropped into the baskets. The grapes in the early days would be dumped onto a platform made of bound saplings with a well-cured cowhide stretched across the bottom. Holding onto poles to keep their balance and nearly naked with cloths tied around their foreheads, arms, and wrists for sweat protection and wicking, the neophytes would crush the grapes until the juice drained into the cowhide. The first fermenters, or when they were short on barrels, which was nearly always, were also cowhides. These bags were made by coating the hides with pitch and sewing them up. The side that previously held the animal's hair would be on the inside, like a large bota bag. Fresh bags were made for every year's harvest, so they would remain pliable for the expanding gases and the active fermentations. The original primitive presses were essentially large wooden nutcrackers that would have pressure applied, or a simple beam-style press that weight could be attached to. Like today, the presses would be used before or after fermentation, depending on the wine style desired. The large platforms were eventually replaced with sloping brick floors, the hide bags replaced with barrels or stone and brick fermenters, and the presses with basket presses. We don't know all the details about the winery at Mission San Jose, but we can look at the larger Mission San Gabriel winery for inspiration. It consisted of a 14 by 20 foot room where the treading would take place, the juice running into a well at the lowest corner before being transferred to the cowhide or barrels for fermentation and aging. The grape yield at San Gabriel was estimated at 2 to 3 tons per acre. Winemaking and storage was tough on the frontier, and as you can imagine, keeping unfortified wine in these conditions was variable at best. It's estimated that close to half the wine production was later distilled into brandy.
When I was working for Julie, there was this guy, Jean-Claude Chanoudet. He would have, they called it the microscope party. In his cellar, you'd come by, you bring a sample of your problem stuff, and he had a microbiologist with a microscope. So you come and you're like, oh yeah, this thing's going off or weird. And they look at it and say, oh, there's Clockera, like this non-Saccharomyces yeast. You come out of the little room, your head's hanging down. You're like, oh, I've got this problem. And then everyone's sitting around like, well, what can you do? And there was certain stuff like, oh, this yeast is susceptible to alcohol. You're in the early stages. So if you blend in, 5% of your last year's wine into this tank, or you water the cap with it, that will kind of kill off this yeast. And so that's an intervention, but you're intervening with your own wine. And that's informed by science, right? Or a scientific understanding of the process.
A big turning point to get into the German and Austrian was in 1989-90 was the year I went to live in Germany for the first time. And I immediately noticed the wines were different. Really liked the Rieslings, a little different than, as my dad called it, the California Kool-Aid Rieslings that we would get here sometimes. So he visited, and I think I took him out to lunch the very next day, lunch or dinner, had a Riesling. And I guess that changed everything because he became very interested in German wines. 2 years later, I went back to Germany again. This time it was a Fulbright scholarship. I requested the same city because I knew people. And it was Rhineland area and lots of grape vineyards. So this time the whole family came, more tasting wine, a lot of wine tasting. And then I guess he just started doing a lot of research. Our dad would be the type that once he got into something, he'd do a lot of research.
So Tegan and I and Nick Finarelli, the winemaker at the facility in Plymouth. So the three of us are driving around Volcano, and we had stopped at some point, and he kind of points up. He goes, "You see that vineyard up there?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "That's the Bailey vineyard." And, Tegan was like, "You should make wine from there," And it was like this, I was like, I wasn't planning on doing that. I didn't think that I was going to be able to make wine, for myself at my time there. And I was just like kind of dumbfounded. And I was like, I would love to. And so it just kind of like set the wheels in motion for that. And that was the first year that I made that wine. So I just made a barrel of that. That kind of started the whole Perch project kind of in motion. It was special for me to be able to, to make that barrel of wine there. It just doesn't really, that's just not how it works, right? Like when you're working for another winery.
Thanks for listening to the second trailer of the Indie Wine Podcast. I hope you'll join us for some full-length episodes. Like I said earlier, indiewinepodcast@gmail.com for comments, questions, or feedback. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.